Agreement.
Thank you very much, Nathalie, and good morning, everyone. Indeed, today I'll have a pleasure of talking to you about the Vienna Agreement. This webinar is mainly addressed to the technical bodies officers. Of course, anyone is welcome, but please bear in mind I will not repeat the basic information about the Vienna Agreement, but I will enter into more detail about practical application of Vienna Agreement, especially taking into account the recent decisions of CEN with regard to the new inquiry with associated vote, the UAP, that have that affect practical implementation of the parallel development of standards. I will very briefly recall some facts and figures about the Vienna Agreement. Then I will move on to the different modalities of cooperation, and I will summarize with a number of key learning points. A Vienna Agreement is a formal agreement on technical cooperation between ISO, so the International Standardization Organization, and CEN, the European Committee for Standardization. It was signed in 1991, and in 2001 a codified version was concluded, which is a simplified, clarified version of this agreement, and that's the version that you can now find on our website. Every several years, the document on guidelines on the practical implementation of Vienna Agreement is also published. The latest version dates back to 2014. This is also available on our website, but please bear in mind that this 2014 version does not yet include the changes that were introduced by the recent decisions of CEN about which I will speak today. The main aim of Vienna Agreement is to optimize the use of resources by avoiding duplication of work at the international and European levels. This is because all members of ISO are also members of CEN, and the Vienna Agreement allows them to develop in conjunction identical deliverables or to take over the deliverables published by another organization by solving the copyright issues, by developing some common drafting rules and synchronizing approval processes. But the Vienna Agreement also gives a freedom of choice, a possibility to proceed separately in case one of the organization is unsatisfied with the results that the common work is achieving. On the graph below the table, you will see the proportion of parallel work in our portfolio. In CEN, about 70% of standards are homegrown, and about 30 are either identical or based on ISO standards. Now, moving on to the core of the presentation today, we can distinguish 5 levels of cooperation within the framework of Vienna Agreement. The most basic level is regular exchange of information between the central secretariats of CEN and ISO, so the CCMC and ISO CS. That means in practice that the catalogs are exchanged on a regular basis, and all standards in principle are offered for transposition on either international or European level, respectively. It is also possible to establish a technical cooperation at the level of technical committees. And such a cooperation can take place by correspondence, by mutual representation in meetings. It can lead to adoption of available publications, and the most advanced level of cooperation is obviously parallel development of common deliverables. And in my next slides, I will enter into more details about each type of cooperation. Vienna Agreement specifies rules on cooperation by correspondence. Please bear in mind that the modalities of such cooperation are subjected to a mutual agreement between relevant technical committees. In practice, the secretaries of these committees are expected to get in touch and draw a sort of an agreement that would specify to what level exchange of documents and comments is required. For instance, this might be that only formal stage documents, inquiry and formal vote documents are circulated for comments, but it is also possible to agree that every draft of a draft standard or another deliverable is actually circulated in the mirroring committee for possible comments, and these comments are then submitted to the lead committee. Please bear in mind, and that's very important, that the comments sent by a secretary of one committee to its counterpart shall always reflect the views of this committee. So this channel shall be used really to notify the counterpart committee of a common position of, for instance, a European committee. Any individual national comments shall be sent directly to the secretariat of the lead committee by the national standards body. In the framework of the Vienna Agreement, CEN also commits to accept comments at the level of CEN inquiry made by ISO member bodies outside of CEN membership. And these comments should then be submitted to the CCMC, who would then forward them to the responsible committee in question. Now, Vienna Agreement also specifies rules with regard to mutual representation in meetings. Here, formal nomination of representatives to meetings is required. Here we mean representatives that would represent the common position of a committee in question, so not their individual national standard bodies. A formal decision by a technical committee is necessary to nominate them, and a maximum of 4 representatives to the other organization are allowed. Preference is given to non-CEN members when nominating to participate in CEN meetings, and it is expected that the representatives of ISO or CEN shall represent a consolidated view of the nominating committee. And this mutual representation in meetings is obviously encouraged in case specifically of parallel work. Now moving on to common work. We have, as I mentioned at the beginning, 2 possibilities within the Vienna Agreement. There is a possibility to adopt available publications and to develop them in parallel. So on this slide, I'm just showing to you some basic modalities of adoption of available publications. In practice, an organization wishing to adopt a standard from the other organization has to submit it to its own adoption procedures. Ideally, this publication should be adopted without a change, thus leading to identical standards with an EN ISO reference. If this is not possible, there are 2 possibilities. Either, and that's a preferred option, the parent committee, the originator, should be contacted with a proposal to start the parallel work that would lead to a development and approval of an identical document. And if that is not possible, then we would proceed to an adoption of a modified version of the available publication. Bearing in mind that such a modified version shall include information on the nature and reasons for the changes to the original publication. In the next slide, I will walk you through 3 possible scenarios for adoption of available publications. Scenario 1, in the first case, at the top, is probably the most straightforward case, which is an adoption of standards for which a technical committee exists. In CEN, that is a delegated decision. That means that any technical committee is allowed to take a decision to adopt at the European level an existing ISO publication. That would still require launching a ballot for creation of a new work item, bearing in mind that the requirement of at least 5 members committing to actively participate doesn't apply here because the intention is to develop an identical publication. However, with the recent decision taken by the BT on the reduction of the use of the UAP, such a standard would be submitted to the inquiry and formal vote track. Maybe you have not yet had a chance to get acquainted with the decision BT 37/2015 on the use of UAP and its reduction to 3 months that was taken in the recent BT meeting on the 28th of October. In this decision, the BT makes it conditional upon their approval for a technical committee to launch a UAP. That means that a BT decision becomes obligatory should a committee want to establish a new work item and choose the UAP track. If the BT approves to launch a UAP, such a UAP procedure would by default last only 3 months. The second scenario is the adoption of standards for which no technical committee exists. In CEN, one of our national standard bodies, for instance, may propose that an ISO standard or a body of standards is transposed at the European level, but it is outside of the scope of any existing technical committee. That means that the BT decides on the creation of a new work item and submission of the document to, and here, inquiry or formal vote track should apply in the spirit of phasing out of the UAP. However, should the document go through the inquiry and fulfill all the approval criteria, the BT would then be requested to decide on skipping the formal vote. Please bear in mind that the decision on UAP is recent and the BT will most probably develop guidelines on its practical application to such cases, but at the moment, this is how we proceed with the documents for which no committee exists. And a third scenario that is also quite frequent is adoption of other published deliverables, such as technical specifications or technical reports. Please note that this is not a non-delegated decision. That means that BT decision is required on creation of a new work item, and such a BT decision follows a decision of a technical committee and its justification. This is to avoid unnecessary investment of resources on development of documents that are non-normative and non-obligatory for our members to implement. Once BT decides positively, the document is forwarded to the appropriate approval process, and in that case, this is now a vote on TS and TR. So it's no longer a TCA, this has also been renamed. And now moving on to the most developed, to the most advanced mode of cooperation, common work, parallel development of EN ISO standards. How does it work in practice? Ideally, before starting any work, there should be an agreement between both technical committees, and such an agreement should also specify, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, the modalities of cooperation by correspondence and representation in meetings. It should also specify who the lead organization would be, bearing in mind that ISO lead is a preferred option. CEN lead is officially possible if it is supported by a simple majority of non-CEN P members of the respective ISO committee. Exemptions are possible where there are legitimate reasons which are acceptable to the non-national members, and these can be, for instance, European Commission a standardization request. But this is existence of a standardization request is not a condition for CEN to request a lead. Once this issue has been clarified, both committees in CEN and in ISO proceed with an approval of a creation of a new work item for common work. After that, work begins and the lead committee handles the document. The document is put to comments and consultation according to the agreed modalities. And it is the lead committee who decides on forwarding the document to the next formal stage, which is in CEN public inquiry, and in ISO it's the DIS. In case of harmonized standards developed under the new approach legislation, CEN consultant would be requested to submit an assessment before the inquiry is launched. The inquiries are synchronized, which means that both in CEN and in ISO they last for 3 months with a 2-month preparation period. And in both organizations there is a possibility to skip the formal vote, the FDs, and to move directly to publication. And here, as promised, I will touch upon the consequences of the new inquiry procedure and its impact on the projects developed under the Vienna Agreement. Last year, CEN-BT took a decision 35/2014 on the 3-month inquiry procedure with associated weighted vote and optional formal vote. That means that in CEN, formal vote may be skipped should the document be approved by a weighted vote, 71% of weighted votes and simple majority of votes cast during the inquiry stage. And this was an attempt to align our procedures with ISO. However, in CEN, there is a need for an extra formal decision by a CEN technical committee in charge in order to skip the formal vote and move directly to publication. To anticipate questions that you might have, what happens if CEN-TC disagrees with skipping the formal vote whilst ISO wants to move on directly to publication? Well, the reason for it, there's only one reason for keeping the formal vote, and that reason is a wish to introduce technical modifications to the document. In the first instance, the CEN committee should then go to the ISO committee and inform them of the modifications they wish to see in the document, and a consultation should take place. Should the ISO committee not wish to integrate these modifications, the last resort worst case option is decoupling from the Vienna Agreement, and that means that ISO proceeds with the publication of an ISO document and CEN moves on to modifying the document, approving it in a formal vote, and publishing a CEN-only standard. Now, coming back to this thread of common development, so we have looked at the possibility to skip the formal vote. Now, in case of a standard requiring a formal vote in both organizations, here again, for harmonized projects under the new approach, CEN consultant would be requested for a formal opinion before the launching of the vote, and the assessment of the consultant will be made known to the ISO committee. Ideally, again, any comments could be integrated and the document could go to the formal vote, be approved and published as an identical EN ISO. In such a case of a dual publication, please bear in mind that automatically the review of the standard in question is always launched by the ISO centralized systematic review, and any revision or amendment would be by default handled by ISO under ISO lead. That means in practice that if ISO decides to revise the document and creates a new work item in support of that, CCMC would automatically create a new work item informing the secretary of the technical committee at the CEN level. Ideally, we would like the ISO committee to let the European committee know that up front, so they can also, like in starting the new project, prepare for this work and establish a need of having a common document. In case of parallel work, it is always the ISO who handles the document, so our editors don't. And the secretary of the lead committee should always submit any draft documents to the ISO Central Secretariat for handling. CEN publishes only the European forward, and in case of harmonized standards, European annexes. We don't publish the actual text of the standard. To sum up some key learning points from today's presentation, so Vienna Agreement regulates on modalities of cooperation by correspondence, mutual representation in meetings, approval of published standards, and lastly, parallel development of deliverables. ISO lead is preferred and a default option for revisions of deliverables developed in parallel. Review is triggered by ISO, but bearing in mind that CEN can always propose a revision of or an amendment to an existing EN ISO. New CEN inquiry with associated vote allows for synchronization of timeframes, but still skipping of formal vote is subjected to the approval by a formal decision by a CEN technical committee. Adoption of identical publications should follow the inquiry plus formal vote track. BT decision is necessary to launch a UAP. Thank you very much. And one last message from me. In case of any doubts, please contact CCMC. We'll be happy to work with you to find a solution. We realize